Yeah, I guess we can begin. Welcome everyone to the second conversation in the AI and Justice series, which is done in partnership between Agami and Sai University and Daksha Fellowship. A warm welcome to all of you to this second edition of this series of conversations. Today we have an interesting panel which will look at various dimensions of artificial intelligence and its impact on the justice system. But before all of that, I'd like to kind of do a self-introduction here. I'm Anand Padmanabhan. I'm Dean of the School of Law at Sai University, and I direct the Daksha Fellowship, which is a program that focuses primarily on the impact of technology on multiple aspects of our society. We train students in technology law and policy. We look at disputes resolution and the impact of technology on new ways of resolving disputes, including online dispute resolution mechanisms and using artificial intelligence to bring in efficiency within our justice delivery systems. We also have an LLM program here at Sai University, which focuses on regulatory studies. So the entire genesis of this partnership between Agami and Sai University goes to Agami's extensive work on looking at artificial intelligence systems and how they can be deployed, particularly at the ground level, to improve the quality of justice delivery, and our theoretical interests as academics and our desire to expose our students to many of these cutting edge themes and topics. Today's discussion will really dive deeper into the whole issue of the different kinds of artificial intelligence solutions that are being proposed to improve justice delivery, the policy challenges, the rights challenges that are involved, and of course, a critical inquiry at any given point in time on where the state of technology itself stands, right? And whether it can, in fact, deliver on many of the promises, and why justice delivery is a very unique kind of use case and therefore has its own set of challenges in addition to all the standard ones that we hear at any point when we talk about artificial intelligence solutions being deployed. So we have a very interesting panel. The way that we'll conduct today's discussion is to have an introductory segment to this whole conversation where each panelist will bring her or his perspective to this topic, and then we'll go on for about 45-50 minutes to do those introductory remarks from each of our panelists, and then we will pick on some of the key themes that emerge in this introductory segment and have a lively conversation around that. And finally, we'll also have some time for questions. So please feel free, all our attendees, to post your questions in the chat window, and we'll take it up either towards the end, or if something very interesting comes up which is relevant to any of the themes that are being discussed, we will also bring it up. I will make sure to bring it up during the interactive part of our conversation. Let me begin by first introducing our first panelist for the day, who is Manish Raghavan. Manish is a postdoctoral researcher at the Howard Center for Research on Computation and Society, and he's an assistant, and he's going to soon join as an assistant professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Manish has studied algorithms used in the criminal justice system, credit scoring, and employment. He's also spent time working at Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. All of them, I should add, are leaders in the deployment of artificial intelligence solutions. He's supported by fellowships from Cornell University, the National Science Foundation, and Microsoft Research. So Manish, I believe you are going to provide us with the basic layperson understanding of how artificial intelligence and learning solutions work. And I believe you have a presentation with you. So over to you, Manish.
Great. Thanks so much, and thank you for having me. It's a real honor. So yeah, my goal today will be to give you an overview of how machine learning works, where it sits in the broader context of AI, and then how it gets applied in the criminal justice system. So just a few pieces of what we're going to talk about today: terms like AI, machine learning, what they mean, and how we can use them. Then a little bit of a window into how machine learning actually works, with hopefully a view of understanding how we can make it work. I'll go over a couple uses that it finds in justice delivery, and I'll end with some questions that you should ask of any machine learning system and some common pitfalls these systems tend to fall into. Okay, so let's start with some basic definitions. So artificial intelligence is a term that gets thrown around quite a lot. It's somewhat ill-defined, and there's no single definition that will really encompass it. My intuitive take on artificial intelligence is something like the following. AI is the set of things you can get a computer to do without directly telling it exactly how to do it. So tasks like vision, recognizing objects, things like processing language and doing translation, algorithms that underpin self-driving cars, things that play games like chess, checkers, and Go, etc. All of these are various forms of artificial intelligence, in that no human had sat and made up rules for what to do in every situation. To some extent, the system itself has to extrapolate what to do from the rules that it's given, from the data that it's given, and so on. Now, where does machine learning sit in all of this? Well, we typically think of machine learning as a subset or a part of AI. Okay, so what is machine learning then? We should think of machine learning as learning from data, right? We design an algorithm and we feed it some data, and out of that data comes some sort of knowledge or insight in some way. What are some key attributes of machine learning? One good way to think of it is it's pattern matching, but it does so at scale. So it's very good. Machine learning in general is very good at finding, detecting, and reproducing patterns. Just some basic things that you should know about machine learning. I've drawn this little table on the right here, where each row, let's say, corresponds to a person in my data set, and each column corresponds to some attribute about them. We often call these features in machine learning. So your age might be a feature, height might be a feature, so on. And in this visualization, you often need data to be much taller than it is wide. You need to know about many more people than you have attributes about them. And the reason for this is essentially, if you have too many attributes and not enough data, you end up in a situation where you can't actually detect whether the patterns that you are detecting are real or whether they're sort of spurious things that just appear in the data. So in general, one of the big issues with machine learning and why it hasn't really been so successful until recently is that you just need a lot of data to make it run. Okay, and actually this is most of the work. Most of the work is in getting good data. In practice, we have pretty standard ways of processing that data once we have it. And there's entire industries devoted to how can we optimize this slightly better, but the general principles behind machine learning are fairly well known at this point. And so a lot of the work, as I said, is just in getting the right data and getting it to be representative, getting it to match what we actually see in the world. For the purposes of today, I'm going to be talking primarily about what we'll call supervised learning. And I'll get into exactly what that is, but supervised learning is essentially the process by which you say, I have a lot of things that I can use to make predictions, and then I have a target, the thing that I'm actually trying to predict. And we'll get into some examples of what that might look like. So what we need then is a well-defined thing that I'm trying to predict, which we'll call a prediction target or a target variable. Those are the types of terms that you'll hear. There's lots of different methods to do supervised learning, and they may actually, mathematically, they may look very different. In practice, many of them will achieve similar results. And so we're not going to go too much into the details of exactly how this is done. But let's take a sort of brief look at what supervised learning is. So we start out with data, right? That's the input to any supervised learning process. And this is going to be a simplified view. In reality, the world is much more complicated than you just have the perfect set of data lying around and you can just use it. But we're going to abstract all that away and say, let's say we start with some data. And I'll separate it into two parts, which are often referred to as X and Y in the world of machine learning, where X is the information that you are going to use to make predictions, and Y is that prediction target. It is the thing that you want to predict. So often, for instance, in the justice system in the United States, we have these risk assessment algorithms that take in a lot of attributes about a criminal defendant and seek to predict things like, will this person reappear for their court date? So in this case, X would be the lots of information you have about that defendant. Y would be, did this person in my data set appear for their court date? So I have all this historical data that I'm going to use. What I'll do is I'll take this data and feed it into a machine learning algorithm of some sort. Now, this could be regression, this could be a random forest, this could be deep learning. You don't actually need to know what any of these terms mean. They are just different ways of taking data and turning it into predictions. Okay, so we take this data, we put it through typically just some standard machine learning algorithm. And what comes out of that is what I'll call a model or a classifier, right? Now, the classifier is the thing that actually, at this point, will do the work. So when a person shows up, we only know, like the next defendant who shows up, we only know their attributes X, right? We don't actually know whether this person will appear for their court date in the future, right? That's the whole thing that we are trying to predict. And importantly, that's exactly what our model will seek to give us, right? The model is set up so that it takes in these attributes X and comes back with a prediction Y. Now, of course, there's all sorts of conversation to be had about, how do we evaluate whether this thing is accurate? What does it even mean to be accurate on predictions that are happening about people's behavior going on in the future and so on? So there's a lot of challenges in actually making a system like this work, but this is the basic structure. You start with some data, you pass it through a standard algorithm, and it gives you a model. And now you can take that model and use it to classify or make predictions about individual people. Okay, so that's the intuition that I think will be helpful for us going forwards. Okay, so let's look at a couple uses that machine learning actually has in the justice system. And I'll give you a couple examples. There are plenty more. This is not intended to be exhaustive, but this is just to get you thinking a little bit. One such example is actually in predictive policing. Now, the goal behind something like predictive policing is to predict where do we think crime will occur in the future, right? And sort of a natural consequence of that is, where should we deploy resources? Where should the police be? Where should community services be, and so on? So again, this can be sort of cast into our framework of, you see a lot of data and you ultimately need to make predictions about where crime will occur. And so in our example, maybe X is a lot of attributes about a particular location, the events that have taken place at that location recently, and Y might be the likelihood of the crime taking place in that location. And so you can see sort of from this map on the left that that's kind of what's going on. Each location has an intensity associated with it. And then, of course, you might do some processing on that later to try to isolate it down into, actually, I think it's this 6 set of blocks where crime is likely to occur. So it's not purely just a predictive system. And in fact, it's not intended to be, right? And we'll get into this in a little bit, but there's a danger in taking these predictions and actually turning them into actions in the world. You've taken those predictions and done something new with them. And we have to think through the consequences of doing so. Now, the other example I'll give you is in, as I said before, in risk assessment. So this plot is actually taken from, it's called the public safety assessment, which is used in a few places across the US. There are 2 predictions that this actually makes. One goes across the top here, which is the likelihood of new criminal activity. And there's a percentage associated with that. On going up and down, you see there's a failure to appear score. So a likelihood to appear in court. Right, and so 2 predictions are made about this person, and then a judge can use this grid to say, okay, this person scored a 5 on one dimension and a 4 on the other dimension. Here's the recommended release level associated with that combination of risk. Again, you are taking predictions about a person and using it to act into the world and sort of intervene on their behalf. And there are risks associated with doing that. And this actually leads me to the questions that we might have there's some key questions that we should ask and pitfalls that we should avoid going into. So I'm going to close out just by going through a few of those. The first question you should always ask is, are the data that you have actually good, right? For instance, if we are trying to predict recidivism, you should ask yourself, what data do we actually have? Do we actually have individual level data about crime? And the answer is, in general, no. We have individual level data about arrests, right? And actually, we only have arrest data for people who were released into the population in the first place, right? We don't have any arrest data for people who were incarcerated. So we started out with this goal of predicting recidivism, but actually we end up predicting something totally different. Now, you might argue that this is still a good enough proxy that it is useful in some sense to be deployed, but it's important to keep in mind that we have strayed from the original goal, and this will have some impacts. Another way that this can manifest is we should be aware of how long ago data was collected. Now, the world changes over time, and as a result, our predictions should also change over time. Now, machine learning works best with quick feedback, right? As the world changes, you need to be able to update and build a new classifier that responds to those changes in the world. And so there's a general rule in machine learning that the longer you leave a classifier deployed, the worse it'll get. It'll get stale in some sense. Okay, so keeping in mind that data are not perfect and we should really interrogate the sources and understand whether they're appropriate for the task. Next, I want to go back to this point about making predictions versus intervening in the world, right? Machine learning is designed to, in some sense, be removed from the world. It's supposed to passively predict things that are going on in the world. But once those predictions start affecting the world, they may no longer be good predictions anymore, right? For instance, if you are using predictive policing, where police resources are sent will actually impact where crime is committed and where crime is observed, right? You might think that sending police to a location might reduce the amount of crime that will take place there because people will change their behavior. It might also increase the amount of crime that you observe because having police presence in a location makes you more likely to observe whatever crime is taking place there. So it's actually not clear what impacts you're going to have, but there are these feedback loops that are not fully captured in our standard model of machine learning. Now, in theory, and I say in theory, techniques exist to deal with this very type of feedback loop. But in practice, they're rarely used in these justice contexts. And a lot of the time, they're just far too complicated for people to really understand and deploy. And they also do need this sort of very quick turnaround time and massive amounts of data that we simply just don't get in practice. So yes, there are ways to deal with this in theory. In practice, we often just end up using standard old machine learning techniques that don't take into account the fact that they are intervening in the world. Okay, machine learning is only as good as the data that we have. Now, what I mean by this is you shouldn't expect machine learning to be any better at making decisions than the humans who produce that data in the first place. Machine learning may be faster and more consistent than human decision makers. It is not smarter. It is not going to learn significantly more than we already have as humans. Okay, so if your goal is to make better, smarter decisions, machine learning is not going to be the solution there. It'll be faster and it'll be more consistent over time. And that's all you should really hope for. There's often a myth that statistical techniques in machine learning are in some sense objective, right? They tell us about truth. But again, I want to push back on this and say, machine learning is only reproducing past human behavior. So it is only objective to the extent that we think that that past human behavior was also objectively correct in some sense. And that's something that we should keep in mind as we deploy it, especially in the context of justice. Okay, and machine learning does not exist in a vacuum. It's not the case that we simply deploy machine learning system and now it completely automates decisions from here on out. In most systems, people still ultimately make decisions. And as a result, machine learning, like any other technology, can be used and it can be abused. So there are all sorts of social consequences of machine learning beyond just the predictive aspects, right? For instance, machine learning requires a lot of data. Where does that data come from? Well, what it does is it encourages some level of surveillance over the population. Similarly, because machine learning requires these massive concentrations of data, it naturally tends towards a concentration of power, right? And so these are, again, features that are part of the broader machine learning ecosystem that we should keep in mind. And the last point I'll add here is that machine learning is notoriously hard to regulate. And the reason for this is, when people make decisions, we can try to regulate those decisions in some way, and we can force people to explain themselves if it comes time to question or interrogate those decisions. It's very difficult to interrogate a machine learning model, right? Whose fault is it that a machine learning model made a certain decision? Is it the person who built it? Is it the person who collected the data? Is it the government in some sense? It's just generally responsible. It's very difficult to pin down blame and assign responsibility for the consequences of a machine learning system. And as a result, it becomes very difficult to set guardrails up that prevent bad behavior. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and please save up any questions you have.
Thanks, Manish. I mean, I think this was actually a very rich presentation in the sense that, while you avoided all the Bayesian stuff and the statistics, which I have no idea about, what I really found very interesting is that there are quite a few of these concerns that we keep questioning in law and policy circles about machine learning that you highlighted, particularly what kinds of data, how long ago was that data collected, questions around feedback loops, right? Like the machine learning itself creates its own reality, if I understood you right there. And of course, I'll come back to you on the one big question that a lot of us are very concerned about, the debiasing of algorithms, right? Like, sure, if human beings are not objective and machine learning brings in that whole sense of partiality into its own workings. Is there anything that technologists can do to address that problem? But more about that later. I think of the various concerns that you raised, in particular the issue about data, the kinds of data, whose data, and the feedback loops, right? I think those have a strong correlation with the kinds of technology architecture that is created, especially when we speak about any kind of consumer-facing product, right? Like, who are the people using that product in the first place? There's a famous study about speed bumps in New York, right? And the roads where, those who have access to the app on their smartphone are able to provide more data, and therefore those roads get alerted first, right? And it's their data that seems to drive policy making. And in the Indian context, we've seen a lot of that even very recently with the Arogya Setu app, right? Because there are feature phone users who really don't have any access to the app. And then, if you're a smartphone user, it's a completely different ball game. Same with digital payments and host of other kinds of solutions. So in the spirit of the whole thinking around design of technology, let me now call upon our next panelist, Dr. Sai Amulya Komaraju. She's a postdoctoral researcher at CDMC MICA. Amulya is also the sector leader at FemLab.co and has looked at salon work and has recently been awarded a research grant from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand to examine the experiences of male workers in highly feminized professions of domestic and salon work within and outside of digital platforms. Her intersectional feminist work in the areas of global digital cultures, future of work and workers, and critical algorithmic studies have been published in international journals such as Feminist Media Studies and Media Culture and Society. So Amulya, I did go through some of your work that you're kind enough to share with us, and I saw that primarily it is getting into very deep questioning around all these different platforms in the specific context of your work, Urban Company, if I'm not mistaken, and the kind of data that is accumulating, the kind of feedback loops that the data is resulting in through the rating system and everything that we have there. So would love to hear more from you on the whole idea of inclusivity and design and how all of that ties into many of these concerns that Manish had flagged in his introductory remarks on machine learning and its limitations. So over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anant, and thanks to Manish for explaining these concepts in such a lucid manner. Before I begin, I just like to locate myself as a researcher. So let me very briefly introduce myself. I'm a feminist researcher interested in gender politics, pedagogy, feminist AI and design, and the future of work and platformization. And all of these interests come from my engagement with scholarship related in these areas. And they inform my work as an intersectional feminist researcher. In a world of experts and specialists, I think of myself as a generalist who has these different interests, and I try to sort of combine different scholarships to think about problems and challenges in my own work. Anyway, so given these interests in my work at FemLab, and because this event is organized by a law college and audiences include students, of course, but also teachers, I think I can bring together my varied interests to talk about what is a very broad area of AI and its impact on law and justice. And I'm no lawyer, so I don't want to preach to the choir at all. So what I can do is to speak to the importance of recognizing and always acknowledging the centrality of humans behind the designing of these technologies and data sets in the assemblages of the human and non-human actors. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to borrow from each of my interest areas to speak about AI and its impact from the work that I do as sector leader at FemLab. So before I get to the more meatier part of the discussion that Anand has hinted at, I'll quickly speak about one of the most reflexive pedagogical theories called the critical incident analysis. This is a theory that's developed by Tripp, and the theory underscores the importance of self-reflection by teachers. So when you're in the classroom and a particular situation or an incident evokes a strong feeling, teachers are encouraged to stop and think about what set it off, what's evoking these feelings. It doesn't have to be overtly dramatic. And this theory can be applied in a range of contexts, right? For instance, like critical incident analysis can be applied to a range of settings, especially for qualitative researchers who are engaging with humans and the messiness of human lives, which are then entangled with technology. So in terms of AI and its impact on justice and law, two incidents stood out to me, especially because I'm engaged with platformized gig work that uses machine learning algorithms to surveil service partners, the number of services that they've performed, they've accepted, the quality of services, reviews and ratings that affect the number of jobs that they get allotted. So anything that uses predictive tools make me stop and think. But there are two incidents that really stand out to me, and I think is disturbing to anybody who reads it, whether they are a researcher or a lawyer, etc., etc. So there was an article in New York Times about how predictive policing tools that Manish was also talking about, how predictive policing tools in the US that are based on data collected over the years are likely to target Black men, because Black men are twice as likely to be arrested, and with all the markers of gender, race, predictive tools used by the police and courts, the criminal justice system, they tend to target Black men. And location-based algorithms are more likely to identify areas with sizable Black population as crime-prone areas. And this supposedly unbiased algorithmic-based data is used to justify surveillance. So can something like this happen in India? Yes. If we were to train predictive tools in the criminal justice system from the records and the data that we already have, and because of the ongoing systemic and structural oppression, it's most likely that people from low-income neighborhoods and people from disadvantaged classes and castes, they'll be labeled as potential criminals. And these are the areas that will be labeled as crime-prone neighborhoods, that's unsafe for women, and therefore surveillance is necessary. Now, this tells us something about removing humans and their biases from thinking about AI. It's a grave mistake to do that, because ultimately we are designing these systems, and our biases and our prejudices will lead to flawed systems. And this is certainly it's certainly not a new point. The problem with data sets and bias and algorithms have been around for quite a long time. Another incident that I'd like to bring to the notice of this panel is this recent feature launched by Swiggy, which is a food delivery platform aggregator. They've launched a feature called heat spots. Now, what this means is that Swiggy has collected enough data and enough data over the years, and then machine learning algorithm now successfully identifies locations in each city where maximum number of orders come from. And this map, this heat spot map, appears on the screen of every delivery executive's app. If a delivery executive logs in from any location that has been tagged as a non-heat spot, they risk their ID being deactivated. They can no longer be associated with the platform. It doesn't matter if the heat spot is far away from an from where an executive lives. It doesn't matter if it's far away from the spot that is going to deliver food. They will be penalized for not being in an area where there is a huge demand. Now, to connect this with the work that I do at FemLab. FemLab is a feminist initiative that examines communicative ecologies of women workers in the informal sector. And since the informal sector is huge, we zeroed in on 6 selected sites, that is of garment, sanitation, artisanal, construction, ride-hailing, and platform and salon work, or beauty gig work, as I call it. I spoke to a lot of beauty gig workers associated with one of the most famous platform aggregators. I spoke to them about their experiences, why they chose to work for a platform, since the system that surveils them and judges their work is so opaque, and they admit that they don't understand how reviews and ratings work. Now, where Swiggy launched this feature recently, a couple of months ago, I had put forth an idea to write a piece on speculative and critical design fiction around platformization that speculates about its dystopian. And now that Swiggy has launched a similar feature that I was thinking about, the very real negative possibilities of combining predictive tools of various kinds and gamification that involves incentivization. This happened a couple of months ago. So for me, it's important not just to think about what is happening currently, but to historicize what's happening, to look at the past and reimagine what oppression and challenges it might present. So please bear with me as I try to speculate what will hopefully be a compelling piece of design fiction for the next 10 minutes. So some platform aggregators have no system of penalty. The gig workers that I spoke with, the gig workers who are associated with the platform aggregator that I spoke with, has no system of penalty. Their gamification is based on ratings, reviews, and incentivization. So when a woman worker, a beauty gig worker doesn't take up a late evening slot, there is no penalty. But there is a system where they nudge the beauty gig worker to take up night slots or late evening slots. How do they do this? By offering incentives in the form of UC credits, which is really digital cash. Now, we all know how Twitter has become a space that is increasingly focused on challenges of gig workers, mostly male workers' problems, but still there's that discussion going on. We also know that Twitter is also a space where violence against women is heavily debated and with such passion. So popular is Twitter that Hyderabad's she teams that was formed to protect women workers regularly, they post about cases that they've cracked, the perpetrators that they've apparently nabbed. The operative word being protect. This isn't a rights-based approach, but the discourse is couched in the patriarchal, paternalistic protectionism. So now imagine if these two kinds of discussions come together to create pressure on platform aggregators to make platform work safe for women. Now, we know one thing that they've already done. There's an SOS feature in almost all the platforms now. But imagine if platform aggregators join hands with she teams or the government and gets access to these hotspots. Now, she teams defines hotspots as spaces where there have been more number of crimes committed against women. So if you think about it, perhaps they might launch a feature, the platform aggregator might launch a feature to appear to be benevolent and, to appear to be doing good to the workers they're associated with, at least in the eyes of the public for brand image and management, and say that they're going to launch a push notification feature that will allow women gig workers to know when they've entered a hotspot area and wants them to be vigilant, right? Do you see the problem? Okay, let me explain. See, we already know that women beauty gig workers have been trained in something that I call the safety standard operating procedure. This is essentially a procedure which puts the onus of safety on women workers themselves. They're not supposed to enter a client's home unless they see a woman around. They're not supposed to immediately report if they feel by instinct, they are supposed to report if they instinctually feel that there's something wrong with the booking. And they also must wait for at least 10 minutes before registering a complaint. And after reporting what happens, nobody knows. At least the workers that I spoke with, they have no idea. Is there a system of penalty? Is the user who's booked the service, is he or she banned from the app? So none of this, that they don't know about what happens once they report a booking of this sort. Now the she teams, and all of this is done just to protect themselves to avoid being raped, actually, to protect themselves and avoid being raped. Now, if you really think about it, she team's philosophy is also something like this. I have a paper with Professor Usha Raman. If anybody is interested, you could take a look at it. So the she team's philosophy is also something like this. They tell women, to avoid going to places that are not well lit. They ask women not to tell people that they're single women living alone. They ask women not to open doors if you don't know who's knocking at your door. And all of this to avoid being raped. But what if the safety feature of hotspot mapping is turned on its head? What if companies design to provide incentives to women workers who are warned about a hotspot, sure, but because they're desperate for work to earn their livelihood, what if they turn it on this head and say that if you do accept work or a service in a hotspot area, we will pay you more, right? So it's important that we're able to see these patterns and reimagine both dystopian and utopian possibilities that artificial narrow intelligence offers. This is necessary because we have to frame fair values, fair corporate governance. We have to think about ethical leadership while these principles are still being framed, instead of framing policies for the purposes of framing them and then thinking about how to change them. It's important that we locate the work that AI does in specific contexts. This brings me to the last point. All this work that we do is not to dismantle platformization as a whole or to discourage startups that do provide employment to scores of people, but rather to acknowledge how discrimination based on multiple markers of identities seep into design-based solutions. Now, human-centered approach to AI is a good step to begin with, but we must also reflect on which human are we centering? Are we centering customers? Are we centering workers? Are we centering startup founders? Now, this is applicable to the application of AI and technology-based solutions in various domain areas and not just justice or platforms. But in a country where stark digital divide exists and there are limitations placed on women's access to digital technologies, what does platformization do? Does it offer women an opportunity to own a device, to access work? So algorithmic surveillance, digitalization, they all must be questioned. Lack of security, precarity, quality of jobs, algorithmic management, surveillance, these all must be questioned. But the idea is not to dismiss platformization because it is a work opportunity for a lot of people who are in need of it. It is crucial that we engage with it. And as a researcher who's involved in action research, I cannot afford to disengage with the platforms and those who put these mechanizations into place. It is possible to be critical about AI-based solutions and also hold hope if we look at what works and what doesn't. It is crucial that we do this. It is crucial that we think about the impact of AI across sectors, because most of the theorizing that happens, it happens in the West for Western contexts. Whether we want it or not, the future of work and otherwise is going to be AI-based for most part. And it's best if scholars, activists, and people who are located in non-Western contexts to deeply engage with AI and its impact on their areas of work and to draw from their experiences and put these practices and developments in context. We must think about decolonizing thinking and theorizing about AI to frame fair values and principles, whether it is for the domain of law and justice or something else. Thank you so much.
Fascinating. I mean, I'm genuinely fascinated with some of these issues that you highlighted and the kind of truth values that go into the design of various kinds of technology-enabled platforms, the kinds of conflicts that can come about on account of the power structures that decide what should be valued, what should be protected, how it should be protected, and all of that. So I think there are deep philosophical, ethical questions that you've really brought into the mix of thinking about AI, thinking about digital solutions more broadly, and especially in countries like India, where platforms are probably the most dominant kind of startup and innovation activity. Who decides what and who is the human around which you're centering all these design questions. I think this the two of you, Manish and Amulya, I think both of you have really helped us, kind of set the context in very rich ways about the various challenges that AI bring about. and the kinds of deep questions we need to think about, regardless of the use case, right? Whatever be the use case, what we need to be thinking about. So with that, let me move now quickly to Siddharth. Siddharth is a postdoctoral researcher. Again, we have a lot of postdoctoral researchers today at the Department of Law, Technology, Markets and Society at Tilburg University, and works on matters at the intersection of law, data, and society. He is founder of Justice Adda, a law and design social venture which develops innovative legal content to make the law accessible, useful, and usable in India. He's also co-founder of DVAN, a design thinking transformations lab based in India. So very interesting, Siddharth. I mean, a combination of entrepreneurship, research, and of course, law as some foundational work from where it all began, I guess. So I think now we could probably deep dive a little bit more into justice systems, right? I mean, Manish did mention some examples, and Amulya referred to some of the pitfalls of predictive policing as we are now hearing, but mostly in the Western context. But I believe that you have a lot to share about how the Supreme Court is thinking about some of these initiatives in India and other recent developments. So over to you, Siddharth. Floor is all yours.
Thanks a lot, Anand, and thanks, Chitra, for putting together this panel. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to try and connect my presentation also a little bit to what Manish and Amulya have said. And what I'm going to try and speak about today is about unpacking a rights-based approach to AI governance in an Indian context. Now, for me, there are three parts to this story. The first part of the story is I want to talk a little bit about rights and managerialism in the context of two projects from the Supreme Court. Secondly, I will talk about how we must think about rights in a vernacular sense, drawing a little bit and connecting to some arguments that Amulya made about the importance of designing for a context and in designing in collaboration so that we can pluralize vocabularies. And in the third part, I will speak a little bit about rights and risks and why it's important to have a sort of rights-based approach rather than a risk-based approach. And I'll say a little bit more on that. But to start off with, talking about managerialism, I want to give sort of two examples, which were also mentioned in the first panel as part of this series. One was that the Supreme Court introduced a software which was called Souza, which was meant to sort of translate judgments into 9 vernacular languages. And this was one of the interventions that they introduced. And then more recently in April, they introduced the SUPACE, which is the Supreme Court portal for assistance in court efficiency. And the purpose of this tool was stated to be in order to have interventions on data mining, legal research, projecting court progress, discovery of facts and evidence. And the stated objective was that it will help pendency, reduce delays, and improve the research capacity of judges who are already overburdened. One of the things that I want to start by talking about was what was very interesting when these projects were launched was the kind of narrative that emerged from the court. There was a narrative about productivity, about how the introduction of these technologies will result in a sort of increase in productivity. There will be an increase in efficiency. There will be an increase in the systematic way in which research takes place. Some other buzzwords that I found was it will unclog legal processes, it would reduce delays, costs, time-bound efficiency, and it would also result in access to justice because judgments will be available in different languages. And to me, what was interesting about these buzzwords was there was a sort of management outlook to how we were thinking about justice. How can we look at justice as something that can be systematized, that can be organized, and that can sort of be enabled? But what sort of was missing was where was the sort of question of how justice will be realized in terms of people's lived context, in terms of their realities. And this raises a question about when we are thinking of judicial reform and when we are thinking of justice reform, are we looking at this as a sort of technocratic process? For instance, in the first case of pendency, and because this was a buzzword, we all know from several studies on pendency that this is a systemic problem in the Indian legal system. It's a question of the fact that we do not have enough judges. There's a problem in the appointment process of judges. There's infrastructure problems in terms of number of courts. There are procedural problems, and there are certain types of cases that end up clogging the legal system. So this is well known. And it is a systemic issue, not one that necessarily can have a technical fix. On the question of translation, whereas undoubtedly having judgments available in multiple languages is a first step, the challenge before us today is, even if we have these judgments available in multiple languages, are we asking the next question of who are these judges writing for? Why are they writing these particular judgments? What is their audience? And there have been critiques, for instance, on how judgments are often written almost by thesaurus, because you have sort of a whole assembly of complex words, which makes it very complicated for the end user. So when we are actually thinking about this solution, are we actually thinking about it more than just something that's efficiency oriented, productive oriented, but actually looking at what implications does this technology have for people's lived context? And this raises the argument that when we are looking at systemic problems, is our interventions often a technology theater, as was coined by Sean McDonald, where we think that where the introduction of technology sort of masks the fact that there are actually structural issues with how the judicial system functions. And Ambakak recently in a paper has also spoken about the fact that are we using AI as a distraction? So I want to raise this point about thinking about this sort of dichotomy between rights and also this productivity. Because when we have to think of the administration of justice, and Justice Bobde in his speech in April said that we will only use it for administration purposes. We won't use it for automated decision making. But are we then making the argument that the administration of justice, the argument that who writes judgments, when cases come up, how it's rostered, are all sort of run-of-the-mill processes which have no sort of politics within it? So how have we sort of depoliticized the administration of justice such that it can be something that can just be automated and we'll solve it? And we've seen that this problem is a huge challenge. For instance, in the use of e-courts or in the use of the CoWIN platform, we saw that in the design of the platform and in its deployment, there were huge sort of exclusions that took place. So are we necessarily centering the question of exclusion, that those who actually need to use these courts or need to use the platforms may not have the necessary literacy, infrastructure, capacities to be able to use it? In thinking about e-courts, which has been much celebrated because the Supreme Court has come up with this vision, we also realized that when the e-courts emerged soon after the pandemic, there were also different kinds of SOPs that were offered in different jurisdictions. Every High Court and the Supreme Court used their own sort of video conferencing tools. So when we are thinking of sort of the use of technology, and we're divorcing it from the fact that it may have a sort of political aspect, it may have a sort of lived reality, that means that we are, the question of rights sort of gets made secondary to sort of arguments for efficiency and productivity. And that's the first point that I want to make in terms of rights and managerialism. The second point is the question of rights in the vernacular. And drawing a little bit also from what Amulya said. So when we think of rights in the vernacular, what I mean here is the argument that can we think of rights in terms of how they emerge in local situations, fashioned in local contexts, such that they can be reinterpreted to how they emerge based on the setting in which they're lived. And the reason for doing this is also because in thinking about rights and in thinking about AI, we need to be able to design for many worlds. It's impossible, and this is something that Arturo Escobar says in his work, that we can't just have one world. We need to have one world which fits in many worlds, because by doing so, we're able to sort of introduce different kinds of epistemic ideas. We're able to sort of introduce invisibilities that take place when data is collected, as both Manish and Amulya have said. And we also need to be able to have different ways of knowing and doing. And this is why there's a huge power to storytelling, both in the sort of design fiction that Amulya used, and also generally storytelling affords an opportunity to be able to highlight certain power imbalances by amplifying voices that are otherwise not heard. So these may be voices of indigenous people, of people who otherwise are not part of policy circles. So what are the ways in which we are introducing these kind of perspectives so that they are made more visible within thinking about AI and thinking about rights? So it's not just a question of finding new conceptual vocabularies for how rights are translated in an Indian context, but also for how AI translates in terms of our understanding of fairness or bias or inequality. And this is something that has been taken up, and there are 3 really interesting projects that I encourage you to look at, which do this. One is an AI lexicon by AI Now, which their argument in their sort of framing, they talk of the need for having a sort of global racialized history, where you take into account struggles of caste and class, where you look at marginalization not as some sort of universalized understanding, but something that has sort of very varied stories, and also look at, and particularly in our context, the colonial influences in terms of how record keeping takes place in terms of data kept with police, for instance, and also our dependencies in terms of how we design these technologies, how we import certain understandings, and what are the kinds of ways in which we are challenging this. Another project which is interesting is called AI for Another by Maya Ganesh, and she argues very interestingly that the purpose is not to say a new theoretical understanding for AI, but rather to actually put a fork and add distractions, because the importance of distractions mean that we need to sort of complexify the fact that there is not just one narrative on how AI and justice takes place, but it is sort of something that is very plural in terms of how it's founded and how it's thought about. And one other sort of example from an Indian context, which connects to both Manish and Amulya's presentation, is some really interesting work done by the Criminal Justice and Political Accountability Project, a group based in Bhopal. And what they did was they also analyzed, and in this long form essay, looked at how sort of police records, which are a mixture of FIRs, a mixture of sort of informal records, by being digitized, actually are able to sort of translate the biases that exist in these police records and create a sort of digital and parallel caste system. So this is some work that actually demonstrates the ways in which, if we just think in terms of the fact that by introducing records and allowing some technology, as the Supreme Court seems to suggest, to increase administrative efficiency, we're not taking into account the fact that a lot of these technologies are not existing in a vacuum. They're very much centered and very much sort of living with the biases and the structural inequalities that as a society we continue to persist with. And then the last point that I want to mention, and I hope I'm not over time, is the idea of rights and not risks. And here I think it's important, because I think one of the understandings from the statement, again coming back to the April meeting of the Supreme Court, where Justice Bobde said we will not use it for automated decision making, is because there was an understanding that a risk emerges. So then are we taking a sort of risk-based approach? But what is the problem of this risk-based approach, which has been said by organizations like the Center for Internet Society in Bangalore and also Access Now, is that there is a sort of subjective assessment of what is a risk or not. What is considered a high-risk domain? What is considered low risk? And as Manish explained very lucidly, there's a sort of unpredictableness to outcomes in terms of the use of these technologies. So we're not entirely sure the nature in which they will take place. The third is the argument that, there's a trade-off. You either you compromise on efficiency and then you will have sort of quicker access to justice. But what are you giving up in the process? Are you giving up a sort of your privacy, your security? This kind of trade-off approach is if we take on risk. And the last is this idea of, when we are thinking of harms and we are thinking of risk, what are we thinking of? Are we thinking of individual risks? Are we thinking of risks based on the community that we live in? Are we thinking also in terms of risks, in terms of accumulation? We may engage with the platform, but it's a sort of, the risk may happen only much later. So what is how are we sort of articulating the question of risk? And this is why a lot of experts now speak to the need of speaking in terms of rights, speaking in terms of empowerment, equity, and having a sort of rights assessment which is independent when we think of these technologies. The other thing that, and drawing from the question of storytelling and drawing from the question of vernacularization is the idea that we are living in a sort of contested reality. We can't assume that contestation is a problem. So can we find ways to integrate contestation, as Lynette Taylor says, so that we're able to represent and recognize different kinds of discourses that exist? By recognizing these kind of discourses and integrating that in terms of what we see as the ways in which AI will materialize, we're also building a more sort of reflexive approach to both law and policy and regulation. One that considers the fact that we have to move beyond sort of technical fixes. And finally, one of the things, a recent report by EDRI speaks of this idea of how we must move beyond arguments of debiasing technology. And why we must move beyond debiasing technology is then we are assuming that the challenge to technology exists in sort of systemic and technical flaws. But we are not assuming the fact that this is actually, there are more structural questions, structural inequalities, powers, and discrimination that sort of enable and influence the ways in which these technologies are both designed and deployed. So can we actually account for a whole political economy around technology and around AI? And in our case, in the judiciary, can we think of a political economy around the use of some of these products such that we're able to account for certain power asymmetries that may emerge in terms of who is designing the technology, who is deploying it, how it interacts, because each of these stakeholders see it in very different ways. And finally, a last sort of thought maybe for us to also think about is do we think in terms of certain impermissibilities in terms of where AI can be used in the justice system? Are there certain guardrails? Are there certain red lines that we say cannot actually be traversed when we are using these technologies? And what are they? What are the kinds of where do we sort of draw the line? And this has come up more recently by the Human Rights Commission, where they said that we need to have a moratorium when questions of justice are at stake. So what is the moratorium for us in an Indian context? And I don't have an answer, but I look forward to hearing also from Nikhil and others on what this is. So thank you.
Thanks, Siddharth. I mean, I think the whole conversation on rights-based models and what that really means, and the conflict between some of its core values and some of these ideas which are driving solutions like Subhas and space and so on. I think you brought that out very well, and of course it's a nice segue to bring in Nikhil, because I think he's someone who has something close to a possible answer when it comes to how do legal and regulatory frameworks respond to these questions. So Nikhil Narendran is a partner at Trilegal, Bangalore, in the telecom, media and tech practice, and he also looks at general corporate practice areas. He has significant expertise in advising telecom and technology companies on various regulatory issues such as spectrum management, resale, voice services, intermediary, liability, etc. And he also works at the cutting edge of several new kinds of technologies. I could see very recently that Nikhil is involved very actively with space technologies and related matters of privatization of the space industry in India. Nikhil is very actively involved with the leading forum for technology law and policy conversations globally, which is called iTech Law. So over to you, Nikhil, to hear from you on some of your work, which you already done at iTech Law on creating certain frameworks, for these guardrails, what the challenges have been so far, and of course the specific use case of the justice system and what are permissible and perhaps not permissible uses from a socio-economic point of view on the infusion of artificial intelligence. Over to you.
Thanks, Anand. This was a very insightful panel. So though I was missing from the frame for some time, what I was doing was that I was busy taking notes. So later I realized that it's been too long since I've been absent, so I came back. But since I was continuing to take notes, so I often carry this pencil because like Siddharth said, I often draw lines for my clients. and tell them these are the lines that you should not cross and these are the lines that you should cross, or you can cross if you want to. And while doing that, the perspective that often I have when I do this, this line drawing business is that I look at it from the client's perspective. But often as someone who is part of, what I call the digital politics, or what I call as, digital activism, whichever name you give it, I often try to ensure that, one, my rights as a citizen, my fellow beings' rights as a citizen are protected. And that's a frame whenever I look at and approach some of these subjects. And also to just talk about the work that I've done in the AI space. So I've been working with iTech Law for the last 3-4 years now on coming out with the responsible AI principles. It was arguably one of the first in the world publication that we came out with, where we lay down the various tenets on which governments and private organizations can implement AI technologies. And we came up with different classifications. So I was specifically in charge of the accountability chapter, because that's an area where I'm quite keen on, because that gets quite challenging. And I believe that that's where governments and private organizations around the world lack, especially in India. And often government and private organizations do not understand the term accountability. And I believe, and of course, the last or the latest new entrants on the block when it comes to tech policy, or any policy for that matter, billionaires, right, who are obviously not accountable at all, but hold a lot of power when it comes to influencing these decisions. So I believe in the accountability framework, and I was looking at AI from an accountability framework. Few things. So I'm just going to jump immediately into some of my thoughts, or what my opinion is. As I'm a lawyer, I'm used to giving my opinion. So bear with me if you don't agree with me. Just thinking about AI and justice, right? So I'm straight away jumping into the topic directly. So I've heard the technical aspects that Manish explained, several of the problems, and both theoretical and practical problems, and some of the good insights that Sai and Siddharth shared. One thing I could tell you right up front is the fact that, look, when we look at something like AI in justice system, or justice delivery for that matter, we are looking at what's known as a very critical application of AI, right? So when you say critical application of AI, what I'm referring to is a EU's, or the European Union's framework, what's known as a new legislative framework, which came in the 1980s. It started as a movement whenever there was a question relating to safety or liability, or if there is some sort of an impact on fundamental rights of a human being, then you need to just look at how much it could impact the health and safety or the fundamental rights of the citizens. And that's a frame in which you will approach a regulation, is what the new legislative framework is. So I'd like to look at AI and justice from that framework, and I will rate it as a critical AI application, which means that it should be used sparingly, it should be used with care. This is not just for justice delivery, it's also equally applicable for anything to do with our democracy, whether it's running the elections or executive functions, etc., etc. So that's the frame from which I will approach the implementation or use of AI. So if you look at AI in government itself, there are several aspects in which it can be used. So one is the fact that it could be used for helping the executive come up with decision, executive to do several functions. It could be policy on code. There could be actual policy or legislations on code which could be directly implemented. There could be enforcement on the code, in the sense that if somebody is doing a violation, then there is an automatic detection and punishment in certain cases. There is investigation that could be a large level automated. Someone could say that we are seeing the crude forms of that by way of this spyware called Pegasus, because before you can even think or chat with someone, immediately there is a blockage on your thoughts and government is snooping upon you, or what's happening in China for that matter. So if you follow what's happening, one of the recent books that I'm reading is this great book called We Have Been Harmonized. I suggest that you look it up if you haven't read that. It's about how China is implementing surveillance technologies to act as a thought police and to ensure that their citizens are not crossing the lines. This next step is actually adjudication and helping of and the use of AI technology in the adjudication process that currently exists. But I can immediately, just to give my opinion on this, I can say that I can see two different or possible implementation of AI currently. So one is actually the use of AI in non-critical functions relating to judiciary. So I think that's one of the things that we could immediately think of implementing, or even start off implementing for that matter, right? So in the sense that there's a lot of work, a lot of administrative work when I'm talking about, I'm not talking getting into the master of the roster system and allocation of cases per se. There are many other administrative work that currently happens during the whole process of evaluation of evidence, collection of materials, reading of materials by the judges itself, the kind of resources and talents available to that judge to actually finally come up with that judgment itself. It's mostly human in nature, right? If you look at it, the kind of technology that's being implemented currently there is quite basic. And they don't have the level of access to technology that we lawyers sometimes have, right? So I think that's a place where AI can actually start playing a role at this point of time. I'm not saying that it should play a role, or if it doesn't play a role immediately, we'll have a problem. But I think that's probably a good area to start off. The reason is that that's the way any technology, which is a digital technology, will develop is the fact that, look, it needs more data. It needs to train itself. So it needs to train itself with various different kinds of data, different data coming from different sources, and make itself smarter over the years, right? So where can we first apply something like AI? It's actually quite basic at this very, very basic level. Then we look at maybe, I posted a quote from Alan Turing there. So, which essentially means that we can only see a short distance, but we can see plenty there to sort of think about or ponder about. I'm just talking about those short time frame as of now. But the way I look at it is that, look, once it starts training, it actually becomes a building material for something bigger, something grander in future. What shape and form that will take is something you and I may not be able to determine. Probably the generation which is coming after this, they will be actually determining this, for all you know, and we should just wait for that to happen. But the fact of the matter is, I think one of the places where AI could be implemented is actually at fairly basic level, right? So for instance, let's look at the criminal justice system. So we have different grades of offense within the criminal justice system itself. One is with respect to, let's look at, you have classifications like bailable, non-bailable offenses, cognizable, non-cognizable offenses, based on the severity of the offenses. And there are several offenses which will not necessarily have an impact on denying a person of lifelong livelihood, right? And there are certain aspects of enforcement which are quite black and white. It may not be all that black and white. We'll come to that. For instance, regardless of whether you're just driving to see your girlfriend, I mean, you're arriving on time for your first date, and you're just jumping a red signal, a traffic signal, or whether you're rushing someone to the hospital. Fact of the matter is, law doesn't differentiate between these two acts of yours, and the act of jumping a signal is a crime, or is a traffic violation for which a person needs to be penalized, right? So we have, I would say, at least thousands of offenses in India which are of similar nature, and that's probably where the AI can really start playing a role, because the determinant factor is fairly simple. You have an oracle, which is a sensor, and from that sensor, you get the information that a person has jumped a particular signal, and a penalty can be imposed or not imposed, right? There could be, typically in cases, what happens is there could be a magistrate who sits there. Typically, it's even done at an enforcement level, at the police level. The police will come and tell you, hey, pay the fine. If you want to contest it, you can go to a magistrate and say that, look, sir, this is the reason, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if there is a very famous judge on Facebook. I believe he's somewhere in, I think he's in some, I forgot the name of the place in the US, but he's a judge there who sits and gives very, moralistic judgments, where he judges people by his acts and gives, he's a very cute judge to watch on Facebook. So there could be judges like that who will actually sit and pardon and saying that, look, you are actually rushing to the hospital to save someone, you don't need to pay a penalty. So there's always some application of discretion, or what's known as application of human mind when it comes to delivering of justice in India or world over. So if you just apply AI for the whole of this process, then you're essentially taking away that. So there is also a question, do we need to retain that discretion, that human discretion, or what we in our AI principle call as a kill switch, or always a human behind the machine, so that there is someone who is accountable behind the machine to actually sit and take a call on a particular act. We could always retain that. But for a large part, for 90 to 99% of the violations, which are, like a traffic violation, which are as simple as, not paying tax on time, etc., could be handled at the first instance by an AI system, which could be automated, is a good starting point for AI to be implemented. Now, when we look at much more critical aspects where a person's life or livelihood is impacted, that's where we really need to sit very closely and watch where AI has developed. Maybe Manish can weigh in on that a little later. I would call that, currently there is a thought process around the world, and especially in India, that technology can solve any problem. We've seen that with Aadhaar, right? How various practical aspects relating to Aadhaar was completely implemented and sort of pushed forward as some sort of a technology project where, move fast, break things sort of a model. True, it achieved grand scales, but, there were several issues which came on the way. I would say beyond Aadhaar, I think after Aadhaar, I think the major problem that I saw was a project like Arogya Setu, right? So what essentially happened was that you took an ad project, which is essentially based on the fact that, look, people could be proximate to each other, and there's a likelihood that this person may know each other. That's how typically a Facebook makes a recommendation to you, or some sort of an ad was served onto you based on that model. So it doesn't really matter if I see an ad to, hey, do you want to travel to, Maldives, right? Based on a wrong information. It's not going to affect my life or livelihood. But if I'm denied entry to my work establishment, if I'm denied entry from delivering a package, if I'm a delivery boy for Swiggy, it'll have a huge impact on my life and livelihood. And that's what Arogya Setu was doing. And I think that's a fault of Arogya Setu, right? They had all the right things in their mind when they came out with that technology. And world over, if you look at it, it's not just India made that project. Pretty much all the countries looked at contact tracing apps. And what we figured was that the checks and balances in several countries. So we also did a project for Human Technology Foundation, again, under high-tech law. And what we found that was India was probably one of the most strictest regimes on paper when it comes to Arogya Setu implementation, but one of the lax regimes when it comes to protection of rights. But eventually what happened was, government also seemed to realize the mistake and sort of, though it was on paper a mandatory thing to use, a lot of actual practical checks with respect to Arogya Setu was rolled back because they also realized that there are several false positives happening and it needs to be rolled back. So I think that's a good example for us to look at and study from. And one of the few aspects about Arogya Setu, which is actually troubling, was the fact that there was no transparency, there was no explainability, and there was no basis on which there was no the complete data or the complete algorithm with respect to it was not put out. It was put out later, much later. I believe it was just the server side of the code was put out, and the source code the source side of the code was not put out, or it's the other way around. What was said and done? So I think what we need to look at when we implement any sort of technology, whether it's AI or not, fairness, transparency, and explainability is very important. And when we look at using AI in the justice delivery system, I think that's where it becomes very critical. And in fact, it could have the ability of complicating things much more, right? So currently, when you want to judge, when you're before a judge, there are some few basic rules that we need to see whether you are okay with the judge. You could say that, there is a conflict of interest because of the fact that this judge is this person's uncle or blah, 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 who is involved in the case, or he had looked at this case in a different manner. I'm sure that I will not get a fair hearing, various other factors. Public opinion in a particular state or a district is against me, so I will not get a fair trial here. There are fairly basic rules when it comes to, deciding how a judge will essentially, how a judge can essentially be contested. Unless, of course, you're Kangana Ranaut. So there were some fairly wild allegations made by her a couple of days back on the court about, losing faith in justice system itself. Other than that, I think these are the fair rules which existed for a while. And one of the things to notice is with AI, actually, the bar is going to be pretty high, right? One, you need to be transparent as to how we are using the AI. The outcome or how the outcome of a particular decision, let's assume that we are using AI for delivering a judgment or coming to a conclusion, even for that matter, using it for sentencing, right? you need to come up with with a proper explainable system and the sort of data sets that was used to arrive at why a decision was made with respect to a particular aspect. And especially when it involves someone's life and livelihood, the bar will be fairly high. So you will essentially need lawyers and technologists to just go through the whole algorithms and decide and look at the sort of data that was analyzed and not analyzed in coming up with this conclusion itself, which to my mind, at least right now, keeping in mind the fact that we can only see a short distance ahead, right, seems fairly complicated to me at this point of time. So that's where I think the ability of AI to get into these things, train itself, make itself better and smarter is very important. And that's where I feel that the ancillary administrative uses of AI assumes importance at this point of time. So for instance, I think we've been in talks with a couple of jurists from across different countries, talking about how they're implementing some of these systems. Some are impressive, some are slightly scary when it comes to, helping people figure out whether, what is the sort of sentence, right sentence for a particular person's crime, etc. Right? So the question is, what all data gets analyzed in coming up with this assessment as to this is the appropriate sentence for a person's crime. So let's look at a human being currently. A judge is sitting, he is looking at the accused, there is evidence, he's looking at past records, the specific acts, there is evidence in front of him. There is a probability of large amount of bias even currently in the judicial system, right? So it is not that AI will add on a different layer of bias, but that level of bias often cannot be understood or comprehended by us immediately. That's where explainability becomes very important. So currently, to be very frank, lawyers are specialists in hacking the judicial system, right? So if you ask me who should I go to for a particular matter, I will tell you that don't go to this judge. He'll not give you this order because he's got this preconceived notion about you. It could be about your caste, it could be about your religion, it could be about your particular matter, it could be against your company, it could be against a particular matter itself, right? There are several ways in which lawyers hack the legal system. I'm sorry to say that it's, we also sometimes work like this. So there are known biases of judges which are out there for us to analyze and understand. And often we play this role, lawyers play this role of hacking these in the judge's mind and the probability in which judge will go one way or the other. So the point that I'm trying to make is, look, with respect to AI, also a similar problem exists. But with respect to judges, I think the important thing to understand is they're actually, to be very frank, much more transparent and explainable. And they need to come out with that level of details in their order to justify their act. Or at least in theory, they should. There are several judges who may not, but in theory, they should. And I think that's to build in that level of standard into the decision making that AI does is going to be quite I would say far away. Again, keeping in mind what Turing said, and I'd like to also hear what Manish, if he has got any perspective on this. See, other thing that I can immediately say is that, look, with respect to AI, one of the key aspects that we need to keep in mind is the bias factor that we spoke of, right? There are different forms of bias. And with respect to, for instance, let's look at our sentencing system and the use of AI for sentencing a person, right? What is the sort of data that is relevant for AI to come up and give that decision out, right? Is it even possible to mask or completely anonymize certain aspects of a person's traits when an AI makes a decision about a person is an important consideration for us, because this is an actual problem that we have currently. If you look at the data that we have on criminal justice system, right? I haven't done a study, but the studies that I have read is that, look, there is a large number of the population which are economically backward and socially backward, including Dalits and Muslims and various other communities who haven't made much of a way in terms of progress, both economically and socially. They form a large part of undertiles in India who are denied justice because of the fact that they don't get access to justice, and there are certain built-in biases against them within the system, right? If you come to even one of the most progressive states in India, Kerala, there are some communities who are absolutely never represented before in the judiciary at all, in the High Court at all, right? We are still in a situation where we do not have enough number of women judges on the Supreme Court. We don't have enough Dalits on the Supreme Court, though they form a substantial part of the population. Similarly, is the case with Muslims and several other communities. So there is a built-in bias in the system already, right? But where we can use AI as an advantage sometimes, I'm not saying that they should be the decision maker, is to actually be very careful in the way in which we can design AI in a manner where we can also take away from these biases. For instance, we say that, look, when coming up with a decision, a person's ethnicity or caste or religion is immaterial, right? When arriving at a decision, probably with the AI will be better than the judge in coming up with a decision. And this is just a thought that I have that I'm putting across, because just look at it. I mean, a large number of judges are from very privileged background. This is not a complaint or or their problem for that matter. It's just a reality. But when that happens, will they be able to see what a poor common man on the ground sees his life and sort of view things from that perspective? He will not, and he may have biases against him. And not really borrowing the words of EMS Nambudiripada, he once said exactly the same sort of remark against the judiciary, that when a common man comes before it, the bourgeois judge will not be able to understand. So I don't subscribe to all the things that he said, but fact of the matter is there is always some sort of a bias in the minds of judges, especially when they sit on the top of the judiciary itself. And sometimes AI may be able to use AI as some sort of a leveling field to remove some of these biases if we design AI carefully, is my belief. So that, look, let's also look at AI as some sort of a checks and balances against the existing judicial system itself. It need not be implemented out there, but let's create a system which takes away the aspects such as ethnicity, caste, and religion, and all these aspects from sentencing. Let the judge give a sentence, let the AI give a sentence, and let this be used as a tool to evaluate the judge. That's probably a good way to go forward, right? Because we are removing all these existing biases from the system in the minds of the judges and trying and coming up with a system which may actually be even used to rate the judges by a higher authority, right? This is just, some of the thoughts that I have. I'll pause here, Anand, for you.
No, in fact, when you mentioned that example, I was thinking during the e-courts, revolution, Siddharth, pardon me for saying that, very recently, a lot of young lawyers actually said this, that, this is actually great for us because all the theatrics, all the senior counsel frills, everything that judges are visually sort of seeing every day, right? Zoom or whichever platform you use just takes away that whole magic. And then they wanted to go one step further and said, why can't you just mask the face of the person and let it just be the documents and the voice, and then let's see how these orders are passed, right? Are you really going to, so the masking of identities, right, basically. So I think, the one point that struck me with everything that you said, Nikhil, was the emphasis on design, right? So you emphasized a fair bit on design, and I know, Manish, that this is an area where you're doing a lot of work, and being the first speaker, waiting for more than an hour to have your next word in. So back to you, Manish, on a few themes. The first is the whole idea of responsible AI from a technical standpoint. What does that even mean? Does it mean, for instance, that the data sets that you use and the proxies that you use for decision making need to be thought through carefully? Or does it mean that the data sets are de-biased in whichever way technologists approach that problem? Or does it mean that it provides a fair degree of explainability to the final decision that comes about? Is it a combination of all of this? So what really is this whole idea of responsible AI design? I'm sure there is a lot there.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot. And I should say, just thanks to the other panelists for wonderful presentations. And I think I learned a lot just by being here. So when we talk about responsible AI, I think there's a natural desire to look at it from a purely technical perspective and say, oh, if we just fix the data, if we fix the algorithms, then somehow we'll fix all the problems. And I think that is a somewhat naive point of view, that really the issues that we care about need to be considered in context. Ultimately, when we look at these systems, when we think that there's something normatively wrong with them, what that means is that we have some values as a society, as people, as a community, and we want to see those values reflected and embedded in the technology. Now, it's impossible to do that without actually taking into account the full context in which they operate, understanding what our values are, and then working to make them present in the system. Now, whether that be with the deployment of the system, with the people surrounding it, or whether that's actually something that happens technically, there are lots of ways that we might try to implement values. But the fact of the matter is we can't do that without a broader inquiry into the system itself. And sometimes the answer may be, actually, we shouldn't be building or deploying the system at all, right? Maybe that is the right reflection of our values. And in such a case, there's no technical solution that's going to make the system disappear. It's a political one, it's a bureaucratic one, it's an organizational one, right? So in that sense, I don't think we can separate this question of responsible AI from the context, from the people surrounding it, and from the conditions of deployment. And I think just from the other panelists as well, I think I picked up on very similar themes coming out of them. So the way I like to view the technical angle of all these things, we can use technology as a sort of diagnostic. We can use the measurements that we take of a system as a way to understand what's going wrong, right? We can understand, like in the same way that diagnostic tools don't actually solve our problems, right? A doctor giving you a diagnosis doesn't fix that problem, but it does alert you in some way to the problems that are going on. So that's how I would view a lot of the technical methodologies and tools that have been developed over the last few years in the context of responsible AI. They are ways that we can hold a mirror up to ourselves, really, learn a little bit more about why our system performs the way it does, and hopefully with an eye towards how we might make it better, but with the understanding that the way to make it better might not be through technology at all.
I mean, there was a lot of references to Turing and in Nikhil's, like when he began his presentation. And Turing to me is this a genius who really kind of thought about that imitation game and said, look, once you reach that point, right, that's really the kind of thought experiment to tell us or give us a benchmark of, look, do we have perfect or near perfect AI, right? And now we call that whole idea of narrow and versus general AI. And then somewhere what I could pick up from a lot of what Nikhil was trying to convey is that, look, there could be these very interesting narrow AI solutions that you can deploy in the context of the justice system, but the general AI, well, clearly not, because we are very far off. Right? So from what you have seen in the United States in terms of applications and use cases, you did mention a few. How is this whole thinking around narrow AI customizable problems, right, happening at a policy level and at a technology level?
At a technology level, it is very much narrow. There's a particular task that people have in mind, and that is the thing that the AI is brought in to do. And at a policy level, I think the same is true. No one is really of the opinion right now that the right thing to do is just try to build a very general system and let it run wild and see what happens, right? Most uses of AI in the public sector are very much, here's a particular task that we have in mind. Ultimately, it's that we're actually not going to make decisions through this. We're going to provide some recommendation, provide some information to a person. Maybe it's a judge, maybe it's a police officer, who will ultimately take that information, but hopefully also other context and make decisions based on that, right? So I would think of, if we're thinking like the model of operation of many of these tools, I would think of it as like a consultant of some sort, where there's a particular thing that you want to know. Maybe it's a prediction that you want made. And you as an individual, you're not very good at making that prediction because you don't have access. You can't even process that much data in your mind, right? But it is a particular thing that is being predicted. It shouldn't be mistaken for a decision that should be made in the world. That is up to a person to decide. And actually the courts have ruled in the United States, like for instance, in the context of risk assessment, you actually can't do bail pretrial detention based solely on risk assessment algorithms, right? It has to be a judge who maybe has access to that score, but also has access to plenty of other context in the case when they make that decision. That I think is going to be the dominant mode of operation for the near-term future.
Thanks, Manish. Amulya, I'd like to come next to you and bring up a point that Siddharth had discussed, right? The whole idea of rights-based. I mean, that is Siddharth's essential framing, right? Rights-based, model of thinking about AI, and that's one area where feminist scholars have a lot to say. And often they are the ones who question some of the rights-based approaches, right? Privacy, for instance, very good example. Feminist critique of privacy basically says, look, I may actually be better protected against domestic abuse if there is a camera in the bedroom. I mean, there are feminist scholars who have argued that position. And on several other rights-based frameworks, free speech and expression, right? We are seeing a lot of pushback from the feminist critique of what is happening on Twitter or many of the other platforms, right? So you have this very libertarian idea of rights and what platforms should facilitate and where platforms have a responsibility, and feminists are pushing back, right? And saying that, look, there is a lot of conversation going on there which needs to be leveled out, right? Because there's just so much dominance of male power and male expression. So with all of that in mind, right, how do you kind of reconcile some of your positions with what Siddharth was mentioning around a rights-based approach to AI, right? And would you be willing to compromise on a hardline rights-based approach in cases where you, for instance, feel that, look, the AI deployment is actually better than the plain vanilla human story, right? Like the Urban Clap company employee or partner who is able to at least record everything on the platform, right, is better protected than a maid servant who works in some part of the country and is abused on a daily basis on account of whatever reasons, right? Gender, caste, etc., and is in no position at all. So in some ways, the platform is providing that outlet, right, to kind of record these, inter-party transactions and the texture of that relationship a lot better, right? But from a rights-based perspective, one could very well argue that AI is basically operating in a kind of black box. And you did mention some of those black box episodes, right? You complain, but you don't know what happens. So there's just the overall sense of complacency that comes with, oh, there is technology being deployed and there may be a little bit better solution out there, but we are never too sure, right? So do you see any tension at all in everything that I said now? And is there any way that, one does reconcile, if you at all see a tension?
Yeah, firstly, feminism is not a unified theory where everybody agrees what feminism is about, right? The different strands of thinking, like you rightly pointed out, libertarian, radical. But I think we are at a point where most feminists do talk about intersectionality, to recognize that it's not just a monolithic gendered group called women, but there's intersectionality of identities. And the idea about placing a camera in the bedroom, I think, comes from the first, from the feminist slogan, personal is the political. Which is not to say that at least, okay, let's talk about surveillance, right? The government puts forth the idea that having surveillance cameras on the street and well-lit streets, they encourage women's participation. But there is evidence that when cameras are placed, women feel awkward. They feel like they're being surveilled and they don't like going to those places where there are cameras. So I think there's some sort of the idea that the personal is the political is different from how one perceives themselves in public and perceives surveillance in the public. So I get the idea what you're saying, if there's a camera in the bedroom, but the idea is again saying that what happens in the bedroom is not just a micro level thing. It happens at a systemic level. There's patriarchal forces that one needs to fight. And it's good if you're able to draw or ground the arguments that you're making from your own life. That's one. The second thing about, it's good that at least service providers are able to record what's going on, whatever wrong is going on, they're able to record it. Then they're able to report it. It's still better than what happens with domestic maids who work outside of the platform. Perhaps we're jumping the gun there because we don't know what is going to happen. Yes, there's a recording of whatever has happened, but there's also evidence that a lot of people in disadvantaged positions do not go and complain, do not go to the police station, do not register a complaint. And this is true of service providers as well as domestic workers, which is why the law that states, right, the workplace must be expanded to homes as well. If you've gone to a party that has been organized by your company, then that is also a workplace. So sexual harassment at workplace includes all of this. But again, the fact of the matter is that we have laws, we have good laws, but is it enough? If people are not going to, if they're not going to go and register a complaint because of the existing power structures, then what is the point of these laws? In the field that I work, if you think about work, and there are a lot of laws that address exploitation of workers, but the colonial legacy that we've been left with, it's exploitative in nature, it's extractive. So we have a lot of laws that say, oh, we want to protect rights of workers, protect rights of women workers, there's the maternity law, there's a whole host of laws, but its implementation is not happening at the rate at which it should be happening. And also the fact that, if there's no gender or caste involved, picking up from what my co-panelists have said, thinking if there's no genders involved, if there's no caste involved, then is it okay? But we forget that there's so many different types of capitals that, economic capital, socio-cultural capital, that people from advantaged classes and castes have already accrued, that even if you make it like a blank space, which is impossible, things will still go in favor of those who have accrued this different kind of capitals vis-a-vis those who have been disadvantaged for so long.
Right. Thank you for that. And I think, that there are deep questions around design of solutions that you have been bringing up. And I think that really is the real way to kind of think through this whole tension, right? That, while in the physical space, like some of the things that Nikhil pointed out, right, there is huge biases among judges. Somewhere your point is that you have to independently evaluate the virtual space that you are creating, right? I mean, there could be XYZ problems with the physical space, but this is more of an independent evaluation of the kind of virtual spaces. And while on some aspects things may be better, there could be other deeper, problems that come in by very nature of the platform design.
Yeah, and I don't think it's as separate, online, offline, it's a spectrum. So whatever problems exist in the offline tend to get reflected in the online as well. So you have to think about it as a spectrum rather than as completely separate from each other.
So I think, just on this point specifically, right? I mean, just to come in, because it's a great point that Sayamulya has made. So look at the kind of workers who actually are in, let's say, in the urban clap. You spoke about, beauticians and whatnot, right? The amount of exploitative practices in those very fashionably called spas and salons, right, or beauty parlors in India. It's crazy that someone hasn't done an investigation, but if you just go down that route, you will find that there is actually more exploitation that's happening offline than actually online.
Yes, so I've been speaking with a lot of salon workers in the brick and mortar beauty palace as well, and there seems to be, at least because how do I put it? Now they meet customers in a particular kind of setup, so exploitation of certain kind gets reported, so we know that things are bad. But in terms of platformization, because this is happening at the home of a customer, and customer is always the king, things get a little murky. So we don't know if people, like the gig workers I've spoken with, I've had such a hard time actually talking with somebody who can present a negative case study, who can tell me about the problems that are involved when one goes and works in the home of a customer. Because even though there's, of course, your live camera, you take pictures of whatever PPE kits you're wearing, and you have the SOS button, you're able to report whatever complaint, register a complaint. But people really don't, I don't think there's enough power given to the service providers to actually take these features and use them. So I think it's just that, these things are not being reported. And a lot of gig workers I've spoken with also seem to be very wary of researchers. Maybe that's because a lot of people have spoken to them of late. Journalists have been speaking about platformized gig work, maybe because of that. But they seem to be wary about talking about this. And that's one of the efforts that we're trying to make at FemLab. We want to see if they have a WhatsApp group devoid of the trainers who've selected them to work for the company. Is there a workers group? Because they're isolated, they have to collectivize themselves in some manner if they want to fight back, if they want to push back. So that's one of the things that we want to do. And it's still in the preliminary stages. We'll see how it goes.
Siddharth, I would like, before my question, if you could take up, there's a question in the chat window, and since you've been looking at some of these themes, how can AI support human rights with respect to human rights, due diligences and impact assessments, guidelines? Is this an area that you have done some work on? If so, or anybody in the panel who's worked on this, please feel free to weigh in on this question. I do have a different question for you, Siddharth, but
yeah, not specifically on how it can support it, but in terms of thinking of human rights and due diligence and impact assessment of AI, I think one of the questions to think about is who is going to do this due diligence? Is it going to be, are we going to have some sort of democratic audit? Are we going to have independent regulators? What are the kinds of questions they can ask? And what are the standards that we set in terms of what is considered human rights in a particular context, and also maybe reflecting a little bit on what you would asked Amulya about the rights-based approach. And I think one of the reasons, particularly to introduce rights in a vernacular, is to address the fact that how do we sort of bring together different kinds of experiences, different kinds of voices that are otherwise marginalized. So we also think of human rights not as some kind of concept that does not have sort of local interpretations and local understandings, and that's really why I wanted to also bring in the vernacular aspect. So I think similarly, when we are to think of human rights assessments or due diligence, I think there are two parts that I would think important. One is in the framing of what due diligence is, and I think drawing from both what Manish and Amulya said of the importance of context to understand how do we articulate these rights based on the deployment of the technology, but also the design of it, and secondly, to ask the question of where it's being designed, who is designing it, and what are understandings of some of these concepts of fairness or bias or accountability, more than and are we also able to sort of introduce a kind of operationalizing of it, like what are the implications that will emerge if, for instance, something isn't fair? On its own, fairness may be a standard that can also be open to interpretation and vague. How do we sort of operationalize it such that there are sort of ways in which people can sort of seek redressal when there isn't a sort of commitment to this fairness standard, for instance. But yeah, sorry, you had another question.
Yeah, no. So I wanted to really hear your thoughts. I mean, because you did take a fairly strong position against the debiasing exercise, right? And not that you don't like it, it's just that you said basically that it's not sufficient enough, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, I'm seeing somebody like Nikhil who's open to kind of deploying some of these solutions in very narrow context and where there are some clear efficiency gains, right? So what is your position on use cases of that kind, right, which are very narrow, and like Manish who pointed out that is almost, I think, AI is a consultant, right? There are certain settings where and because you were kind of critical of Supes and Suhas and all of that, I just wanted to hear your thoughts because of that managerialism point that you made, right? I mean, are you open to kind of looking at a world where we can try out some of these, maybe even on pilot basis, or is there any way you can bring in those technologies in your conception of rights and AI deployment in justice systems?
So I think, to me, I think one of the reasons for bringing in the managerial aspects was also in terms of the narrative around how the technology was introduced, how these projects are introduced, and also the kind of objectives that are stated in press releases by the court. Now, this sets a certain expectation that what this technology will do is it will address systemic problems that for years we have had problems with. And I think this is where the problem is. There is a sort of mismatch between what is projected as a narrative and what are the kinds of masking of other structural challenges which take place. And I think Manish also connects with this, and Manish, correct me if I'm wrong, but he also made the point of it being sort of a diagnostic tool. and not a decisional tool. And diagnostic also means that the scope of what the possibilities are limited and specific. Not that the introduction of this tool will mean that we will deal with pendency, we will have no delays, costs will be low. So I think it's also a question of constructing a narrative which in a way sort of addresses the fact that when such technologies are deployed, they also have a sort of material context to it, and how do we acknowledge that? And I think it's important for the court to also acknowledge it, that this is that we are sort of focusing on some of these areas. Now, how is it that the court has decided? And there are others who have more experience of this than me, but that we can take sort of administrative aspects as being depoliticized, as I tried to mention. So for instance, it may mean that it's a question of sorting cases, the question of sorting particular kinds of judgments. It may soon be a question of like determining who sits on what bench, and a kind of rostering of systems. So at which point does the administration of justice move from being sort of technical as it's currently seen to being something that has sort of political ramifications? We've seen in the last year during the pandemic, as the court takes on a new sort of leadership, that a lot of these systems change, and that it results a lot on the discretion of the judges. So in what ways are we sure that the application of these technologies can be disassociated from the discretion that goes into sort of managing their application? And I think this is really where I think that has to be sort of clear. So if we can have clear guardrails and say, okay, this is, these are certain places, and this is, we're going to commit to this. It can also be in non-tech things. For instance, in the appointment of judges, and in the who gets appointed, why they get appointed is a question that's been critiqued for years and for its opacity. So it's clear that, to me, that administration is not something that is a technocratic process, and I think that's why, even if it is used in narrow context, I think we need to be explicit that these are the kind of implications that it may have. And the other question of experimentation, I think, again, with experimentation, we need to have sort of consent, and we need to make this open. Who are we experimenting on? And if I'm a litigant, then do I what kind of voice do I have in terms of being a part of this experimentation process? Because it's not just the judges that have a part in, or the court administration that have a part in experimenting with certain technologies, but lawyers, but litigants. And we've seen this with the eCourts project, that there's a narrative of success, but there's also a narrative of exclusion, that many lawyers have just not had work because they can't join online courts because they don't have the apparatus. So that's, basically, I think we need to like bring together these perspectives.
Thanks. Amulya, you had a point.
Yeah, actually, this question is both for Siddharth and Nikhil, because we're talking about using AI for small purposes. But I was thinking, from my own data collection, the software development engineers I spoke with, they speak about reducing human intervention as much as possible, and they introduced a feature that would automatically order products for the service providers. Now, what they did not foresee, and this is the agency of the algorithm there, what they did not foresee is that the algorithm started ordering huge amounts of products, and their money was getting cut. And the service providers didn't know why that was happening, and they rushed to the urban company. I'm not going to say the name, but to the platform aggregators office. And then the founders found out about that, and they said, okay, let's hold back this feature for the time being. Let's perfect it and all of that. So, experimenting with such communities is going to be a problem because it is a question of their livelihoods. And I'm sure when you're experimenting with cases where marginalized populations are involved, then that's going to be very tricky. And it's also, in some way, it's unethical, right? So how do you negotiate that tension?
Nikhil, would you like to take a crack at that? The deployment story, which is very common to all of us who've been working on Aadhaar and some of those.
Yeah, of course. I think this is a problem. I mean, this is a real problem, and that's why I think we need a kill switch, right? And I think we are not at a stage of our evolution. I mean, there are many technologists, friends of mine, who believe that agency can be given to the algorithm, right? To my mind, it's far away. It's probably several generations away, not in my generation, at least. That's why my belief is. Complete autonomy and complete surrender of agency, the way I would like to put it, we're not living in that era. And these sort of problems are fairly common for any sort of technology implementation, whether you use it for governance or, for public governance or for internal, private governance as well. If you use these technologies, it's fairly common. So it is not, that's why I said, look, it is not possible to fully do away with human autonomy, at least in the near future. One, the technology is not ready. Second, I'm not ready to give up my autonomy, right? So it's a very, or at least I'd like to believe that, right? So I keep telling about this, I mean, I think probably we are at some point of time, we are all negotiating with our autonomy at some level. When Matrix was released in sometime in 1999, I think 1998, that was the time when Matrix was released. We were given the option of the blue, the red pill and the blue pill, right? Or the green pill, I don't remember. But we had an option that consent was meaningful, right? Nowadays, it's not possible to live without several of these platforms which are currently existing. So there is no real choice there. There's only one pill given to us. You want to connect to other people, then you need to be on this platform. I mean, same as the case with the Zoom platform that they're using right now, right? So we don't have that choice. That autonomy is sort of being eroded over the years. At least in terms of public governance, I think we are really far off from that being happening, and it shouldn't also. I don't think that. That's why I said, look, the use of AI should be sort of to assist. And in fact, what Manish said, right? I mean, AI can sometimes be a consultant. That's a sort of a good way to start off, and let's see where we go from there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in fact, with Aadhaar, one of the big critiques was, apart from all the questions around how you use the data and whether you can deny the exclusion point that Siddharth has spoken quite a bit about. The other point was, who is developing all of this? I don't want to get too much into the questions about the vendors and the selection processes, all of which are more questions relating to bureaucratic governance than AI. But I think it is worth a thought or worth a reflection on what are you looking to build out of all the data that comes out of all these solutions, right? Whether it's SUVAS or Space or anything else, and what do the developers in this whole game get to benefit out of it? And I mean, is there a sort of India stack type thinking associated with legal tech and with justice tech, if I may call it that? And what would that then mean? I mean, I'm sure there are some positives that could come out of that too, right? I mean, like there were some positives that came out of India Stack, in my view, like follow-on innovation and so on. But I think that's also something worth thinking about. Nikhil, do you have any thoughts about that, the whole stack model, and anything you could do to justice tech?
So I think, look, I would say that, look, I think the problem is actually with respect to accountability and transparency, right? That's something that was sorely missing from Aadhaar or even Arogya Setu, though there was some sort of an effort on the part of Arogya Setu to later come out and clarify a lot of things. But these are things that should be upfront. These are thought process that should be upfront when you undertake a project which has got the ability to disturb someone's life and livelihood. And if it almost came as an afterthought, and there was actually a lot of push from civil society, and even some of the people who worked on the whole model, they worked on a lot and achieved the level of transparency that we have currently. But these should be the first steps that one should undertake when undertaking a project like this, and that's how rest of the advanced world or the Western world, they operate on that basis, because there is a probability that it may get struck down by a court there. But in India, that doesn't exist. So, and if you look at Aadhaar, what eventually happened was that it created its own network effect, that you literally cannot live in India without Aadhaar, right? So to the extent that Supreme Court was like, sort of forced to accept its constitutionality to some extent. And it happened by design due to several factors, including the fact that there were several delays and the government sort of ignoring the court's dicta when it comes to several things. The courts often ignoring the fact that they're being ignored. Several aspects came together. Then there was also, it also happened due to the design of the whole thing. So there was a strong favor from the ruling government and the establishment as a whole in its favor because they saw many benefits. I'm sure there are several benefits. I don't think we can just sit and say that, look, there were no benefits at all. And sometimes these sort of models essentially, there needs to be more accountability for people who are acting in this front. So if you look at it, Indian civil societies or Indian social activism's accountability is essentially only if they take foreign funds, right? Other than that, there is no real accountability. And the other extreme that I would like to say, again, coming back to that point, is the billionaire accountability. Right? There are several billionaires in the tech space who have got the ability to determine the way we think and live, right? What is the level of accountability that they have? If their companies are filing their annual returns, but are they filing an annual returns? I mean, shouldn't they be filing an annual returns and disclosing what they're doing? Because they seem to be influencing so many public decisions, right? So these are questions that we really need to ask. I mean, these are not really related to law and justice, but these are questions that we really need to ask. And because of the fact that a person is, and they may be doing many things right, but we should all be allowed to know what they're doing also. And we should also be allowed to point out if they're going wrong. And there is no accountability there, and there are indirect benefits that may accrue because of this. So that's the fault of this model. I'm not saying that this model hasn't given us benefits. There are benefits that, and we are all sometimes the living beneficiaries of some of these benefits of the system. And that's probably the reason why we are sitting here and talking. But fact of the matter is there are more people are actually sitting outside and not getting benefits out of it. So how do you sort of build a much more equal framework when it comes to this is an important question. And one thing that Anand slightly not related to the question that you asked, but something again coming back to the point that I just spoke of, right? So if you just look at the capital punishment, the cases where we have given death penalty in India, it'll be interesting to see how an AI will determine and whether a capital punishment needs to be given, right? If you take away some of the aspects of, aspects relating to their origin or their community, where they come from, etc., etc. For instance, I think probably the AI will sentence, Ajmal Kasab, who came from Pakistan, even if he took out the Pakistani aspect from his sentencing, right? Probably, but it would have thought differently when it comes to somebody like an Afzal Guru, right? I don't know, because the AI is not subject to public opinion, because public opinion is an important part of justice delivery system, and sometimes you cannot completely take out public opinion as well, because justice is not just about it's not really black and white. Public opinion often plays a very important role in justice delivery systems, sometimes to the positive advantage, sometimes to the negative determinant. For instance, you look at any case which is a sensational case, like for instance, you call it a media sensationalized case. Often you will see that 90% of the case, if there is not really very good evidence against the accused itself, they end up being punished because of the fact that the courts at the lower level, they are more subject to media scrutiny. They're more subject to public opinion per se, because they live more closely to very close to the society, that even a judge's driver may question him on his decision, or at least ask him, "Sir, why did you come up with that decision? Why did you let him go?" Whereas if you go to the High Court level and Supreme Court level, you will see that these are really flimsy grounds that the prosecution came up with, either by design or by, that's the way it is. It was anyway a weak case to start in the beginning. So public opinion plays a very important role in these aspects. And AI, I don't know, will be able to even gather this and figure out. And even if AI were to gather and figure out, how do you sort of use this metric that AI is given, then to finally evaluate a judgment which is given in the past?
Alas, we've come to the end of time. I don't see any unanswered questions in the chat window. For those of you who still have doubts, queries, please feel free to address it to us, and we'll make sure to pass it on to panelists if you identify the panelists who you would like to get to address that query. So I think what we've really learned over the course of the last couple of hours, if I were to just capture it, is that there are huge limitations that technology comes with. And in the context of AI and particularly applying it to justice delivery systems, one big challenge is the explainability challenge, right? Because explainability, unlike in the context of fintech or many other solutions where you deploy AI, is an internal value to the justice system, right? I mean, sure, your bank loan guy could give you reasons, but if he does not give you reasons, well, that is unfairness. But in the context of the judiciary, that is not just unfairness, it is just plain invalid, right? It's an invalid decision. So that decision is basically, there's an input error, so to say, right? So if that's the way you think about explainability, then there are very narrow cases like what Manish and Nikhil and I think the rest of the panel too agrees. There are some very few cases, where we can maybe deploy AI as a solution, more like a consultant. And even in such cases, like Siddharth pointed out, for instance, there has to be a lot more thinking around the choice of vendor, the transparency that Nikhil highlighted, or as Amulya pointed out, to think about larger ramifications of this platform model, right? So I think each of you have in your own ways pushed back really on AI deployment. And I think it is definitely a point for all of us to think more deeply about, especially in these times where we also know that physical courts are still reeling from the effects of the pandemic. There are huge challenges in resuming normal court activity. So perforce, we are all to some extent pushed to adapt to technological solutions, but what they mean and how you use it or go to the next level of predicting outcomes is, I think, something that from this panel, at least I could gather, there is a fair amount of caution that is being advised from each of you for your reasons. So on that note, we do have one more conversation as part of the series, and that's on October 2nd. You will get more details about the conversation, the time, and so on. So stay tuned to what we are doing here. And thanks once again to Agami for putting together this opportunity for Sai University to get involved in these conversations, and to my colleagues Mahesh and Chitra, who've done tremendous work, and Sheetal and a bunch of others who are working with us at the back end to make this happen, Saurabh and many others. So thank you all, and hope to see the recording soon on